My mother made me cry. Sorry. When Shelby was diagnosed, I was tested negative. My husband was tested as negative. If Shelby does have a child, is she going to have a 1p36 child?
So she has a normal chromosome 1, and she has one that's missing the 10.
I'm not really sure. We just were told by our geneticist.
This is almost 100% that they will have one normal copy,
okay,
and they'll have one copy that's missing the tip, the little puff at the end of the tip that I showed in my previous talk. And she can pass on either of those chromosomes. So in theory, if she has a child, there is a 50-50 chance that that child will have 1p36 deletion syndrome.
Will the child be like, I know there's a severe and there's not severe,
So since we don't know what causes the severity, the answer is we can't be really sure. In general, somebody who is higher functioning is likely to have a child that's also higher functioning, but it depends also on who the other parent is and what their abilities are and their genetic background. It also depends significantly on what happens after the child is born. And so it's not, the outcome isn't defined at the moment of conception by how big the deletion is. What happens during the pregnancy has some impact. What happens after the delivery and as the child is growing up has a huge impact on what is the final functional outcome of the child. So it's not all the genes. What happens in your home makes a huge difference, but it's not the only thing. The size of the deletion does matter. The other genetic background of the family does matter. The kinds of therapies that you have access to does matter. There's a lot of things that go into that. And one of the reasons we can't predict at birth, this is what you can expect, and have it be accurate, is that there's so many things that go into what happens at the end. What level of achievement is this individual going to have that we just don't know because they haven't happened yet.
Thank you.
Hi. I just wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about a terminal deletion versus an interstitial deletion. Aaron has an interstitial deletion.
Okay, so a terminal deletion means the whole tip of the chromosome, the very end piece. So there's a cap on the chromosome called the telomere. And what it is supposed to do is keep the chromosome together. Make sure that the ends don't fray. It's like whipping at the end of a rope. So a terminal deletion is missing the telomere. And an interstitial deletion still has the telomere and probably has some genes that are real close to the telomere in it. So whether that's important depends on how much of that added information is still there and which genes, this hasn't been sorted out yet, but which genes on the end of chromosome 1p are actually the key players in causing the 1p36 deletion syndrome. If we knew that, then we could look and say, well, is that gene still there? Is it still functioning? And then we would have more information. The amount of, so when we first discovered 1p36 deletion syndrome, they thought the tip is always just broken off. It's not that simple by any means. The first microarray study of 1p36 found that a lot of the deletions are complex. They'll have skipped regions, so you might have the tip is missing, and then you have a piece that's there, and then you're missing a little bit more. You'll have some where there's a piece that's missing, but also a piece that's duplicated. And that's part of the reason that there's so much variability. That doesn't explain all of the variability, but some of the rearrangements are quite complex. It's not a matter of somebody just took scissors and cut the tip of the chromosome off.
Okay, our daughter was adopted, and her birth mom has lower intelligence but she's high functioning and she's parenting another child. We kind of have a feeling that she probably has 1P36, but she has too much anxiety for us to bring up, hey, maybe you should get tested. Is this something we should push because she is parenting a child who is typical? Is it possible that her other child could be a carrier?
If the mom has 1P36 deletion, the birth mom has 1P36 deletion, then the other child who is typical would have almost by definition had to inherit the normal copy of the chromosome. So it's unlikely. If the birth mom's lower intelligence could be due to something else. So if the birth mom has a translocation, then the typical child could have inherited the translocation and be at risk to have children with 1P36 deletion, even if the birth mom doesn't have it. So testing the birth mom to give information to the typical child would be a worthwhile thing to do. It's a matter of how do you address that in a way that's not threatening to the birth mom and that the birth mom can actually understand well enough to be able to give that information to the other child. The other question is, would having a diagnosis actually benefit the birth mom? And that's kind of a hot topic right now in genetic circles. My prejudice is it could, because you could then say this is a well-defined condition with the following needs and get services for birth mom that would help her to be able to run the household more effectively. That doesn't always work, and right now is not the time to try adding services to an adult who's been independent. Politically, it's just not a good time for that. But in principle, it's a good idea to provide parents who have limited capacity with support so that they are able to fulfill their responsibilities in a more effective way.
Well, we've only seen our geneticist once or twice maybe, and that was when our daughter was first diagnosed, so like 4 years ago. Didn't really say much to us, and we're just wondering, should we go back and see him again, or how often do you see your patients? What do you talk about?
I think you're the 5th person to ask me this today.
Oh, good. I'm really on that.
And 2 or 3 people asked me that yesterday.
Oh.
This is a big topic, and there's divided opinion, and to some extent it depends on the community in which you live. So in my practice, depending on the age of the child, I recommend seeing almost all of my patients if I think they actually have a genetic disease back. At some point, the frequency of seeing them back varies significantly. In a newborn, I try to see them about every 3 months and kind of go through and make sure that the family really understands the syndrome, that the child is plugged in for the services that they need to maximize their potential, that the plan is updated often enough, and that we have looked for all of the major complications of that are related. So in 1P36, we look at muscle tone, oral motor skills, and feeding, for seizures, get an eye exam, get an echocardiogram, and then do a lot of education with the family. And then space that out as the child gets older to every 6 months and then to once a year. I usually don't go longer than once a year unless I'm trying to wean them off. So there are some conditions where they don't have any more needs after a certain period of time because developmentally it's not an issue and we've addressed the other things that need to be done. And so then I will go every 2 years, and then eventually I don't need to see you anymore. But for kids with developmental issues, I usually don't go don't go longer than once a year because I lose patience, or I don't know enough about what they're doing currently when they call me and say, "I need you to send in a letter saying that my child needs." I can barely remember who your child is. It's hard to write that. And or to call the school district and say, this child needs this service that's different than you usually provide because. So, I have a child with 1P36 that I wrote a letter to the school and said, this child is nonverbal but knows enough sign language to be able to communicate and needs a sign language interpreter because having the teacher learn 5 signs isn't good enough because you need to know more than be quiet and I need to go to the bathroom. That's not an education. You need to actually have somebody who can communicate and tell stories and make jokes and communicate. And so we're writing a letter to get that across to the school district. Sometimes we're successful, sometimes not, but you can't make a strong statement that's individualized to that patient unless you have seen the patient. In some places, however, genetics doesn't do that kind of long-term follow-up. They see the patient, they make the diagnosis, they provide the initial information, and then they figure out which specialty is going to deal with the major problems and say, you need to talk to these people. And so you may end up with a developmental pediatrician being the main person that you go to in those communities. Philosophically, I have a problem with that. I think the person who makes the diagnosis and gives the initial advice has a moral obligation to follow up and see if what they're telling you actually works. And if they don't see you back, then they can't know that. And the negative feedback that I get from families is probably as important as anything that I do as far as improving my ability to function as a physician. It's also not really comfortable to have somebody tell me that I'm wrong and that I don't know what I'm talking about. But it happens, and I learn a lot from that. So, how often should you go back? How important is it? If you're in a community where the geneticist is a person who gives a diagnosis and doesn't do follow-up, going back is probably not going to be very helpful for you. If you're in a community where the geneticist does do a lot of follow-up and they're not answering the questions that you need answered, then asking them very directly, can you help me with a given problem, is something you should do. And if not the geneticist, then find the person in the community that does take that role on. Depending on the specific structure of your area, that could be the pediatrician, it could be a psychologist, a neurologist, a developmental pediatrician, a cardiologist. It's the person who will listen to you and take your question seriously and go and look up the things they don't know and then help you get the question resolved. So kind of a long answer, but it varies from town to town.
I always have questions. What would you say to a person who, once we've received the 1P36 diagnosis,
do we keep looking for answers to symptoms? And what I mean is, I've got a cardiologist who sees my daughter and says, so she has seizures. I said, yes. Well, why does she have seizures? And I said, well, she's got 1p36 deletion syndrome. And that's not a very good answer, is it? And he says, well, because your daughter's cardiomyopathy could be caused by a mitochondrial issue, and this could also be linked to her neurological issues. And so I'm going to contact your neurologist, and we're going to do some testing, and they do, and nothing comes of it. But it occurs to me, do we stop looking because we've got this syndrome diagnosis?
So that is a really good question. And the answer is, if everyone stops looking, we will never know any more about the syndrome than we do today. So somebody needs to keep looking for those answers. You, on an individual basis, if you're looking at, what is the, to use big words, pathophysiology, or what's messed up about the way the body works that causes the seizures, you're unlikely to find that looking at a single child. The way to address that question, if you want to address it, is to get a lot of kids with 1p36 who have seizures, and as many as you can who don't have seizures, and try to find out what's different. Or to use animals or cell culture techniques and look at what each of the genes does and how does that perturb the function of the cell, and does that then translate back to the seizures or the hypertonia or whatever the problem is that you're interested in. So from a physiology standpoint, it's perfectly fine to say, you know what, I don't want to do that right now. If you have a problem that needs an intervention, say you have a child who is getting repeated pneumonia, that can cause permanent lung damage and become a life-threatening problem. And my immediate question is that child aspirating saliva or food and getting it into the lungs, and that's why the pneumonias are happening? And because there are things you can do about that to fix it. And then you can keep the child healthy, and a healthy child is more likely to move forward than an unhealthy child. And a really unhealthy child, meaning having lots of pneumonias, is going to deteriorate and eventually have complications and probably eventually die if we don't interrupt that cycle. So if it's something where there's a specific treatment that they're wanting to implement, if they find a specific abnormality, I would say yes, you should look for that. If it's something where they want to know, wow, I wonder if 1p36 deletion leads to mitochondrial dysfunction, and that contributes to a decreased seizure threshold, that would be really interesting. Then it's, okay, write a protocol, I have 50 friends with this disease, let's do some real science and not use my child as a shot in the dark.
Hi. I have kind of a two-part question, and then I'll ask a question first to help me answer. Are you involved in a lot of research as well with genetics, or mainly just?
That depends on how you define research. I am currently listed as an investigator on about 15 clinical trials, none of which are 1p36. So I do some of that kind of work where there's a drug that's being developed to treat whatever disease, and we need as many patients as possible. Do you have any? If I do, will I enroll them in the study? Yes, I will, as long as it's a legitimate study. I also get involved in natural history studies of diseases quite frequently. And if I see something that I have never seen before, and I find that nobody seems to have ever seen it before, then I try to get that into a forum where the next child who has that problem, it's not a complete mystery, and yes, you can find out that it is associated with whatever their underlying condition is. So on that level, I do some clinical research. I do not have a laboratory. I do try to trick laboratorians into doing work for me sometimes.
I guess the reason I asked that then is the two-part question is adult stem cells. I don't know how that works in with genetics, if that's something that is being researched. And also, what can we do as families, more particular to 1P36? I obviously don't want them to, hey, we got this new jet thing that we can put in here. But can we tell our stories that would help researchers maybe come up with new medicines and stuff? So
the stem cell therapy that is being marketed fairly aggressively in China and a few other places, where they're taking adult stem cells and using them as a therapeutic agent to treat a variety of conditions. The current status of that is it's an interesting idea. The people who are doing research in that using animal models to try to, where they'll do something like induce a spinal cord injury and try to use stem cells to recover that, are taking the same idea and doing it in a very systematic way. What's being offered in people currently probably isn't helping a lot because there's not any data collection, and so you get anecdotal reports of people saying, oh yes, this works, and those get publicized a lot, but you don't know how many people they did the same treatment to, and you don't know what other therapies were done, and you don't know nearly enough about it to know whether the stem cells actually helped. And as far as the research end of it, ever since I got here, actually even before I got here, ever since I was asked to come and do this, I've been thinking about what could we do with a couple of 100 patients that would add to what we know about 1P36 and be of practical value to the families. And I think that there's a lot that could be done with this group that would be doable, and I've talked to some people about that already. The challenge to that is that somebody needs to sit down and formulate a question and then formulate a way of getting the answer to that question, get that reviewed by an ethics review board, and then come up with the resources that they need to do all of that stuff and get it done. Some of the things could be done, I think, with minimal financial investment, but there's going to be a fairly significant amount of forethought that needs to be done before we start collecting the story, as it were, so that we can then have a way of analyzing the information that we get. I do have some ideas and some people that I want to talk to when I get home for questions that I would like to answer. And I think that I could probably come up with 5 or 6 things that would have minimal cost, but that are questions that I at least have not been able to look up the answers for.
Probably good for a president of some organization too.
We've talked.
Yeah, he's one of the people that I talked to about this. And the other thing that I think is useful is there are people who need projects. So in my institution, I'm a program director to train people to be geneticists. And everybody that I train has to do a project that results in some kind of publishable data that moves the understanding of a genetic condition forward. And you know, if we have something where I can say, I can guarantee you that you will have enough patients to do this study, and they're really nice people, then it's a lot easier to get them to do it than if I say, what I want you to do is first think of a question, and then find the patients that you need to answer the question, and then write the protocol, and then write the grant, and then start doing the study. That's not going to work very well. So having this group of committed people with a lot of energy and some very good questions to work with, I think is a good start on getting people involved. And we just need to do that, but take the next step.
Okay, one of the questions I have for you, I was fascinated to hear in your lecture this morning this idea that there are researchers looking at specific genes and this idea of treating according to a specific gene. Recently, we were having horrible issues with Jordy's seizures being out of control, and we had just gotten the results of her microarray back, and it pointed to that there were some issues with specific genes known to have characteristics that would actually affect her epilepsy. And so we went ahead and actually chose different medications based on those channels that seem to have issues. She's contributing.
She hears your voice.
Yes. So one of my questions was, what we saw was a dramatic decrease to her seizures by approaching her seizures according to, let's do the drugs according to the genes. And when I ran that idea past two epileptologists and one neurologist, one epileptologist and neurologist said, well, it doesn't hurt to try. I haven't really tried that approach, but let's give it a shot. The other one said, there's no way this is going to work. And I looked at the results and said, well, what we're doing isn't going to work right now, so let's try something. Can you just expand a little bit more on that idea of looking at specific genes in terms of trying to figure out what we can do to help our kids in the areas?
The issue is that you're ahead of your time. So this is a hot topic. The Human Genome Project was done because of the promise of being able to do exactly what you are talking about. In any given individual with seizures, how can we figure out what causes their seizures? And of the 100 or so anti-epileptic medications, how can we pick the right one that will get the maximal control for this patient? So the individualized medicine. To date, the ability to do that is fairly limited because there are only a few genes that we know enough about their function to know that this anti-epileptic medication works by controlling the flow through this ion channel, and therefore is the best one when the problem is that ion channel. There are getting to be more of those. And the new high-throughput sequencing, they're doing whole exome sequencing, which means sequencing the coding part of all the genes, the part that actually makes the protein, but ignores the regulatory elements of the genes that sort of have the on and off switches and the volume switches for the genes. And there are also people trying to do whole genome sequencing, which means taking all of your DNA and sequencing every gene and looking for ways to target specific things. So they put out a request. They want people to say, I will take epilepsy and I will collect 500 people with epilepsy, sequence all of their genes, and then interpret that and use it to plan therapy by finding the specific genes that have mutations in them. And scientifically, that will move the field of seizure control forward dramatically because we'll have far more information about the details of what causes seizures than we've ever had before. And in principle, it should also help to control their seizures. The problem is there's only going to be about 5 studies awarded because it's a very expensive and work-intensive process to analyze all this data. And we don't know which diseases they're going to pick. Another challenge to taking the approach that you're taking is in 1p36, there are a number of genes, and a lot of them we don't know much about. Nobody has studied those particular genes. And so we don't know which gene contributes to what to which symptom. And it could be that it's more than one. So the hypertonia, there might not be a gene in 1p36 that causes hypertonia. It might be these 6 genes interact with each other in a way that causes hypertonia. So it might not be as simple as that gene and we can target. But we are developing ways of getting to that. So there's a guy named, last name Hirschhorn, who is studying high throughput sequencing things. And he's come up with a concept of pathways analysis, where you look at not the specific gene, but you find a gene and then you find out what pathway it interacts with, and you find drugs that interact with that same pathway. And then if you knock out one of the genes in that pathway, then you know all the drugs that are available that modulate targeting. If you can find the step after the gene that's missing, and you can regulate it with a medication, then your chances of success are going to be much higher. And that approach is showing a lot of promise, but it's also in its infancy. There are only a small number of conditions that we can target effectively with them. So the answer to your question is, your approach is valid. The reason the physician said, I don't think that's going to work, is because we don't understand, for example, phenobarbital, which is a common anti-seizure medication. We have no idea how to control seizures. Somebody gave it to somebody who had seizures, and their seizures decreased. And then they said, I'm going to try that on the next patient with seizures. And theirs decreased. And so now we give it to people with seizures because it decreases the frequency of seizures. We don't know enough about how it works to be able to target it to a specific gene. Some drugs, Depakote, for example, we know a little bit more about, and we can target that one a little bit more effectively. The newer drugs are going to have a lot more in the way of understanding about how they work than the older ones, but we still don't completely understand how a seizure medicine stops seizures. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't take the approach that you are advocating and try to figure out the answers to those. And especially if you have something where nothing has worked yet, the choice is either just take drugs randomly one at a time and test them and then throw them into the work pile and then pick another one until we get something, or to sit down and say, okay, is there enough information here to make one of these a slightly better choice? You're not going to do worse than random taking that choice. You're at least going to do as well as random, and probably going to do better. So I think looking at the individual genes and also looking at science that's being done on the individual genes. And at lunchtime, we were talking about a number of things, but one of the things that came up as well is a lot of science being done on tumors that relates to 1p36 deletion, because a lot of tumors have deletions of 1p36 or duplications of genes in that region. So finding out as much information about what the genes do as possible by looking at that literature would be helpful, assuming that we have the background that allows you to actually get something out of reading that literature. Some of it's really hard to understand, even for a physician, unless you happen to be in the field that it's written on. So I'm not saying that as parents you should do that, but having people whose tasks, so if you get a big enough support group, you could have a committee that, whose job is to sort of scan the literature and see if there are things that might be useful and pull them in. I think it's a valid approach. It's just very challenging at this point because we don't have enough information.
I have a question about what to watch for in the future. My daughter is 21 and was diagnosed at 18, so she was diagnosed really late, but she wasn't born with any cardiac issues. Is that something that could still develop, or is it really just more of a congenital issue? I know the hearing loss can increase, so that one we have been watching. And then also she has kind of that Prader-Willi type eating, and I'm wondering, is there anything that's effective with Prader-Willi people that can be used also to turn off her appetite? Hers started after she came off ACTH for her seizures when she was about 1. She was really eating a lot on the med. She came off and she quit eating for about 6 years. And then she just, when she started eating, just all of a sudden just, really would eat quite a bit, but also just didn't have that turn off when to stop and that you were full. So I just want to know, those two things what to watch for, and is there anything else that we can do about that?
So what to watch for in adults is a very good question and one that I would love to answer, except that nobody's systematically addressed the question. There are ways to get at that. One of the things that I'm doing in a different disease is I've divided children up into first year of life, years are age 1 to age 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 20, and then adults. And I have been working my way up in age and just going to families and saying, what happened medically in this? Actually, I've been going to medical records. I lied, I have been going to families. And the IRB wouldn't let me, and I didn't have time to sit down and interview the 100 families or so that we had. But in that disease, the focus has been primarily heart problems. And we just finished the 5 to 10-year-old study, and the heart problems were barely an issue. The big issue for them was language, primarily, more than anything else. And that's a complete mind shift for this disease. We were very excited because now we know what to look for in that age group, and we need to push that and get the emphasis to be in a different area, because we have been largely ignoring the biggest problem that patients are getting surgeries for and getting hospitalizations for. So the answer, the specific things that you mentioned, the hearing loss can progress, so yes, you need to monitor that. cardiomyopathies can progress, but if I understand correctly, the limited information that we have in 3.6 is that it is not a progressive cardiomyopathy. And that
it is generally identifiable in early childhood, so if she doesn't have it, I think it's unlikely, but I can't say that it's impossible. The heart malformations, you're either born with or you don't have them. So BSD and ASD, things like that, you don't need to worry about that part of it. Are there new things that can pop up in adulthood? We don't know, because we don't have enough information on adults. To do a meaningful study on adults, if we had 20, we could probably do something that would have significant value just by reviewing what is their current functional status.
Just ask, what would you consider an adult for that type of small study?
Well, I usually go with the standard, so depending on my mood swings, either 18, which is the legal limit for an adult, or 20 because it's a round number, or sometimes 21.
Because they can drink, yeah.
Yeah. It's just kind of the divisions are random. The reason I like 18 and 21 are because that's when people are being pushed out of the school system. And I think that transition actually is something that needs a lot more attention. One of the things that I do an adult genetics clinic. I'm involved also in a prenatal genetics clinic, but the adult genetics clinic, one of the things that we deal with very, very frequently is acting out behaviors. So these kids have been going along and they have limits, but they're doing okay. People are dealing with them and they're making some progress. And then they get to be an adult. And now they're having violent temper tantrums and they're biting people and they're kicking people and they're acting out, and we're going, what's going on with that? So I worked with the only adult developmentalist I've ever known. And he and I sat down and went through a bunch of the patients and we said, what's going on here? They didn't all have the same diagnosis, but they were all acting out. And so we started going back and looking at their history and asking all of the questions, and it turned out that what happened is they had people working with them and stimulating them, and they had goals, and they were getting feedback, and trying to make forward progress and getting rewarded when they made progress. And they had a structured day with meaningful activities in it. And then they hit 21, and the school district dropped them. And they didn't have any place else to go, and they were plopped down in front of a TV set, and as long as they weren't acting out, that was good enough. And they got really bored. And then they got irritable. And then they acted out. And we discovered that people need to have meaningful lives. Which kind of makes sense. But I think that's one of the things to look for is active engagement. Not for 10 or 15 minutes a day, but for enough time to fill a day with the rest of society. And that can be holding a job. As I mentioned to one of you about a service called Project Search that we have in Cincinnati, and one of the things that they do is take people with limited abilities and they customize jobs for them and try to get them a job that is a legitimate contribution that they can do with as little supervision as they can get it down to, and that's worth paying for. so they make a little bit of money, and they have a meaningful job. And this is not, it's all levels of ability, as long as they are able to find something that they can do. And, you know, taking jobs where they've taken people who, like, they had people who can count to maybe 3 to 5 and not beyond that. They can't do addition and subtraction, but they can count to 3. And then they find a job that they can use, but then they have that limitation on, and then they need to be able to function in the job and check things off so that they can keep track of it without having
to go past counting to 3. And they're able to do that. And then they train both the company that the job is going to be in and the individual who's going to do the job on how to do this and how to collaborate, and then that gives them meaning. And even if they could get just as much stimulation in a workshop setting where they're being given physical therapy and things like that, they actually do better in a job setting most of the time. And so finding meaningful engagement, I think, is a key. Obviously the weight, and when you have excessive weight gain, then you need to monitor for all of the complications of that. So you need to be checking for diabetes, for lipid abnormalities, for obstructive sleep apnea, which incidentally, I don't know if anybody's looked for it, but I would guess is probably increased in 1p36 deletion just based on the hypotonia. So those are some of the things that you could look for. It's not well documented. We don't know what the late complications are. We don't have a good idea of what the average level of function is for the current adults. I made a statement earlier that I think that even given the limited information we have now, that the kids that are here, plugged in, people are keeping track of them, are likely, even without any further scientific advances, to do better than the people who are currently adults who had no information about what their disease was as they grew up. But we'll have to wait and see. And one of the things that I think really needs to happen is a way of tracking what's the trajectory. You've seen growth charts, and they plot, and they can say, you know, the head is supposed to grow this much in this period of time. If we could get a developmental chart for 1p36 deletion that says, you know, 50% of the kids walk at age, and it's not going to be the same age as the general child, which we know is about 12 months, plus or minus 3 months. But I don't know what it is for 1p36.
We actually have on the Facebook characteristics and milestones where people put the information about their child and the different milestones. But I've actually passed that information along to all.
Yeah, I've seen that. To have that information be, it needs to go through some kind of validation, and so we have to collect it very systematically for it to get to the level that you can say, this is really the range that's considered normal for this disease. It's a fairly involved process. Now, the Facebook thing is a good start. And having people post, this is when my child did this. But I think to really get to the question of how do we say, at what point should we expect what things, and how do we improve that performance, you need to be collecting, doing planned assessments at specific times to measure level of function using specific tools. That's the same tool, so that if I'm doing it in Cincinnati and somebody else is doing it in Denver, we're using the same tool and getting this comparable information. And then it becomes very powerful.
So I have a follow-up on that. You've said that there's a number of things that we could be doing, and I think as parents, we kind of sit back and say, yes, there's a number of things we could be doing. So how do we actually bridge that gap between helping to get the medical staff to actually do this and to get us to really be on board and to encourage this process so that we're not just our own little group here?
That's a really good question. There are several steps to that process. I think the first one is establishing a formal baseline and then publicizing that. So you do a baseline natural history study where you collect, and you would have to figure out what pieces of data to collect, but as much information from as many patients as you can, and you tabulate it and you say, this is the expectations for initial presentation for kids with 1P36, and then you can pick targets. So if you say, wow, 90% of these kids have hypertonia, then function can improve for hypertonia with exercise. Physical therapists should know which exercises. Then you find a physical therapist who is interested in these kids, who maybe has seen a couple of them, and you get that physical therapist and some advisors, some other people who maybe, someone like me who's interested in 1P36 syndrome, and you sit down and say, let's make an exercise plan for the child with hypotonia and 1P36 deletion, and then get the person who has the most expertise on those exercises and say, if we do those, how much improvement can we expect to see? And then you pick a population of kids, hopefully at a similar age, and you do that intervention on some of them, and you don't do it on others. So you have a control group. And then you measure at age, so you say you start that assessment at age 1, and you have a planned exercise program to improve muscle tone and therefore muscle function. And then you do the exercise program on 25 kids, and the other kids, you don't do that exercise program. You just let whoever's taking care of them recommend whatever they recommend. And then at age 3, you do another formal assessment using this validated tool, and you measure that, and then you say, which group did better? If the ones that had the planned exercise program did better, then you say, we recommend that this exercise program is better than baseline function and benefits these kids, and that everybody with 1P36 deletion and hypotonia should be enrolled in that kind of therapy. I can hear you.
You can repeat your question.
Okay, so being the practical hands-on person, I understand that. So we have our control group, we have our test group. Does that mean that it does boil down to, as individual parents, forming that team around us and then publishing those types of studies on a case study basis? Or how do we really start making sure that we're pulling in teams of professionals and that we're starting to see action happen?
You collaborate with the teams of professionals and find people who are interested, and hopefully find resources between you and the teams of professionals looking for, okay, where's somebody that might have some money for this? do fundraisers, so you have seed money to get people's attention with, and you collaborate with the teams of professionals. Now, one of the things that's hard is I talked about having a control group. Some problems we don't want to wait for a control group. There are ways of doing some of these studies that don't require a control group, so you don't have to leave somebody completely untreated and then treat other people. You can do, so for example, if you have physical therapists who says, I can get kids to walk 6 months earlier by doing this kind of physical therapy, and then you have another physical therapist who says, but I like this other physical therapy program. Then you can say, well, instead of having a control group that gets no treatment, let's do a comparison of approach 1 and approach 2. And then you treat both, and you reassess them, and you figure out which one was better, or maybe which kids will benefit from which approach. Same thing. But it all comes down to working, and some things are going to have to be done on an individual basis. You're going to have questions that come up that need to be addressed, that you don't have the time or the ability to do a whole program, and so your child needs something, like with the seizure control. You're not going to wait until you identify 200 kids that you can divide into 4 groups to test 4 different drugs and find out which one is best. You're going to have a child with seizures who's having a lot of seizures. You need to treat them. You need to find somebody who will listen to you. But then we need a way of being able to track down the kids that have had seizures and try to see if there are things that we can find out from them that will be generalizable to the greater population of kids.
I kind of maybe a kind of crazy question, but you know, in some of the information when I was first looking, my daughter was diagnosed about 7 years ago when she was 10. And it was like some of the information was like, oh, it's a very common chromosome deletion. Like 1 in 5,000 or 1 in 10,000, however that is. And I was just like curious how they could say that it's kind of common when it took forever to find people that have it. You know, I mean, I was like, you know, when you're looking at Downs and all these, and I was like, common. I'm like, how common? I haven't found one person in Nebraska until I came here. You know what I mean? But I was like, how can they say it's common and it took so long to find it, and it's not common when you don't know it?
So common is relative. So if you ask a pediatrician for a common disease, 1P36 will not be on the list. Okay? They will think of that as a rare disorder. The federal government defines rare disorders as any disorder where there are less than 200,000 people currently with that disease in the United States, and so 1P36 would be a rare disease. On that basis, because we don't have even close to that number of patients. But the reason that it's described as a common chromosomal problem is if you look at chromosomal deletions, most of them, like some of the better known ones, Wolff-Hirschhorn syndrome is 1 in 90,000. And so 1 in 5,000 is a lot more common than 1 in 90,000. And that's what we're comparing it to when we say, so if you go to a cytogenetics laboratory and you pull all of their records and you say, what abnormalities have you found? And how many, so you know, if they've done 10,000 samples, you're going to find Down syndrome is going to be the most common single diagnosis by far. And then Turner syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome, these are whole chromosome abnormalities. And then you get into the broken chromosomes where you have duplications and deletions. Not a whole chromosome is abnormal, but a part of a chromosome is abnormal. And the most common of the small deletions duplication disorders is 22q11.2 deletion, and that occurs in about 1 in 4,000. There is, as far as we know, no other piece of the chromosome that's more commonly abnormal than that. A lot of them are only reported in 1 or 2 papers. There might only be 20 or 30 people with some of the chromosome deletions. And when you take 1p36 and say 1 in 10,000 people has this, that's a lot more than 20 in the history of recorded medicine. So, to be able to have a meeting where you bring together potentially 100 people with that disorder makes it a lot more common than most of the possible. There are millions of possible chromosome deletions, but very few of them are going to be seen as frequently as 1p36 deletion. So it is both a rare disease and a common microdeletion, depending on your perspective. For me, the diseases that I work with are considered sort of bread and butter, the things that any geneticist should know as long as they occur more frequently than about 1 in 30,000. And it's still considered our relatively common diseases up to 1 in 50,000, and then we start to consider it to be a rare disease. Pediatrician, if it's 1 in 50,000, they don't even need to have heard of that. It's just not common enough. 1 in 5,000, pediatricians should have heard of it. We haven't publicized 1p36 deletion well enough that most pediatricians have heard of it. So there's some information that needs to get out there. We need to publish more information, make it recognizable, so that the pediatrician doesn't say, they're a little behind, let's just wait a little bit longer. We need to get people to start asking the questions soon. Okay, I have a question for you guys now. Of all of the things about 1p36, what are, say, the top 2 or 3 things that we need to have better answers for? Hearing seizures a lot.
That seems to be the most common thing that's on any of our discussions right now, is seizures, what kind of seizures kids are having, what medications, side effects, how do you deal with them, medically, like Shelley has seizures all the time, she's on 4 different medications for it, but that seems to be my biggest thing.
The reason I say seizures is because if you tell me the teen has 1p36, this is how he's going to grow, she may or may not walk, I can deal with all that stuff. Watching her have a seizure just tears me apart.
It's the scariest part.
Seizures are uncomfortable and also dangerous. They're prone to complications in and of themselves. So I think that's a good one. Another one that people have mentioned several times is obesity. Is that one of the priorities?
It's like, well, the kids in their public are so small now. Like, my daughter was very small up until like 8, 9, or 10, and all of a sudden, no matter what we did.
It's like a switch gets flipped, and now.
Yeah.
You hear that a lot from a lot of families.
It was just
So the overlap with Prader-Willi has been mentioned a few times, and I think you asked about that. I didn't answer what we do with Prader-Willi. So Prader-Willi syndrome, the management, and it's pretty successful if we can get families to buy into it for weight. So the RDA diet is a 2,000 calorie diet, kind of a one size fits all, as if we all burn the same amount of energy every day. Kids with Prader-Willi syndrome will gain weight unless you get them under a 1,000 calorie diet. this is an adult-sized patient. They need less than half of the calories of someone else just because their metabolism is set that much lower. The other things that we do is a prescribed exercise plan. I've actually had good luck with getting the schools to facilitate that and have built in walks or games or things for the kids with, so as part of the IEP, putting in, a once a day mile walk or something so that the parents don't have to do that. But those things, they're pretty simple. They are not the only things that we do. The other thing we do with kids with Prader-Willi that has been a huge benefit in weight control is treat them with growth hormone.
Does that work for dogs? I mean, for older?
That's a good question. We don't have a lot of data on adults because the adults with Prader-Willi, getting them to comply with the diet is almost impossible.
Well, my daughter will have like severe behavioral issues. And she would, she would say something all the time. And if she doesn't get stuff, then she's gonna have a big.
Right, they have meltdowns, and actually the families with Prader-Willi buy locks for the fridge, and for the cupboards, and for the garbage cans, because the kids will go to all of those places and pull out food. They deal with the change rooms. The kids in Prader-Willi, we know all of the kids are going to become morbidly obese if we don't control their diet. So we start working on dietary management before they get fat while they're still in the failure to thrive age, and we start growth hormone therapy to get the most benefit. You want to start before their first birthday. It helps with the muscle tone, it helps with bone mineral density, and it helps with brain maturation, all of which help those kids so that they actually have better behaviors, better cognitive abilities, and fewer medical problems if we treat them with growth hormone. Could that work in 1P36? I have no idea. Nobody's tried it. A similar approach is taken in 18, which end of the 18s, I don't remember, in one of the 18 deletion syndromes, and there's a syndrome called Jacobson syndrome, and growth hormone has been very successful in helping with management of that one as well. So it's at least worth looking at. The problem is getting people to give growth hormone when the outcome you're measuring isn't added height. Because there's not, even though we have data that supports it, there's not a lot of buy-in that growth hormone as a weight management tool is a good idea. As a height management tool, there's a lot of buy-in.
Well, she was fused at age 10, spinal fusion. She's totally fused for scoliosis, so she really couldn't grow fast and much anyway.
Yeah, the growth hormone has more effects than just height, so I don't know if it'll work. There are also the potential to look at other pathways that involve appetite. In Prader-Willi, they've looked at a lot of other drugs that are supposed to be appetite suppressants and that are supposed to increase metabolism. For those patients, for Prader-Willi, none of those medicines have worked. So the mainstay that they've used is growth hormone. We should not focus exclusively on growth hormone for 1P36 because it's a very different disease than Prader-Willi, but we should look for something that can find that. We should also look at what is it about the brain that's causing this appetite stimulation. I'm guessing that it's insufficient hypothalamic activity in the brain, but we would need to do functional MRI studies on a group of patients to prove that, and then we could look at things that target the areas that are abnormal.
So you asked us a question, we did, what other things? I mean, I knew we had talked about speech, you know, is it where they can't say what they want to say, or is it something else?
And based on the stories I've heard here, it seems that there's probably a global cognitive disability, or there's certainly global cognitive disability, but it appears that there's also a number of kids who have had more understanding than anybody recognized because they couldn't let anybody know. So, should we study speech in a formal process and say these are the speech problems, and then get input from some speech therapists on what kind of interventions might work for this group of kids? Absolutely, we should. And will that help? I can't make any promises. I think it will.
There's no on and off on those, yeah.
Really?
Yeah, it's up there.
Okay.
So we're.
So it's, I think we're at dinner, aren't we? We're like right almost 5:30 or so. Yeah, okay. So thanks for sticking around. And then, yeah, after 7 o'clock.
7 o'clock in the dorms, there's 3 different floors of activities.
Right.
There's popcorn on the first, and trees down there, and so grab the trees and find the floor and get comfy for the night.
And grab like a whole like pile of whatever dessert they have at dinner.
Right, there you go, James.